Now, all this was going on at a time when Portugal's own fortunes were far from stellar. You see, in 1580 it had become subject to the Iberian Union, when young Portuguese King Sebastião was killed in the Battle of the Three Kings, or Alcácer Quibir, in 1578. If you recall, the Portuguese had in 1415 managed to wrest control of the small fortress of Ceuta from the Moroccan Sultan on the North African coast. This victory was a hollow one, with little profit to be had from it, while successive devastating victories by Ottoman commanders, such as Barbarossa, discouraged them from any further eastward forays in the Mediterranean for the time being. Instead, they turned all their attention to the Atlantic west coast, gradually making their way south, probing for Muslim weaknesses that would afford them a continental foothold and opportunities to again access the trans-Saharan trade caravans. Eventually, they managed to subjugate the coastal ports of Ksar el-Segir in 1458, Asila and Tangier in 1471, Azemmour in 1486, and Safi in 1488, and thereby virtually blockading all of Morocco's maritime trade. Things were looking shaky for the Berber Wattasid dynasty ruling out of Fez, and when in 1505 the Portuguese managed to conquer the Atlantic coastal fortress of Agadir, adjacent to the Canary Islands, a political crisis blew up in response. You see, much of the southern part of the country was governed by an Arab Saadi Sharifi dynasty that traced its lineage right back to the Prophet himself, and though nominally vassals of the Berber Sultan in the north, they took upon themselves the holy task of expelling the infidels from their ancestral lands. But in reality, they ended up having more success only displacing the current Wattasid Sultan, who was increasingly being viewed as incompetent, such that by 1550 they had occupied most of the country's major interior cities and forced the abdication of its current sultan. The Portuguese saw the writing on the wall and evacuated the northern ports of Ksar es-Segir and Asila before the new ruler, Muhammad al-Sheikh, or the Ottomans, dislodged them. It should be said, though, that there was no love lost between this new sultan and the encroaching Ottomans, who had absorbed pretty much the entire North African coast into their expanding empire. The Turks, keen to tie up this loose end, approached the Moroccans and demanded their submission. But the new sultan, a proper old-school Muslim, was having none of it, and so Muhammad al-Sheikh and Suleiman the Magnificent now found themselves in a Mexican, or should I say Maghrebian, standoff. Battles raged across the entire country, cities fell and were retaken again, as the Moroccans fought tooth and nail against both the Ottomans and factions of the preceding dynasty. In yet another shining example of the Machiavellian nature of international religious politics that my viewers have come to expect, the beleaguered Moroccan leadership now reached out to the Spanish, who were themselves currently under siege by the Ottomans and hanging on to the port city of Oran by the skin of their teeth. The jihad would be put on indefinite hold if the Spanish would send troops to help them in their resistance to the Ottoman onslaught in Morocco. Never was the adage, "my enemy's enemy is my friend," more aptly applied, as the Spanish nervously agreed to the deal. But as Ottoman pressure mounted, the beleaguered Moroccan leader was assassinated by one of his own bodyguards, and the Ottomans went on the offensive, pushing ever deeper into Morocco's heartlands, and now appointing the dead leader's more, shall we say, compliant relative as a vassal governor, bypassing the dead sultan's son and rightful heir. A flurry of correspondence was now sent across the Straits of Gibraltar, with the denied heir making overtures to both the English and French kings to support him against both the Ottomans and his new ally Spain. Yes, you heard that right. Confused? Sure you are. But wait, there's more. The newly installed puppet sultan, Abd al-Malik, who had replaced his brother, the rightful heir, and was basically just an Ottoman shill, was nervous about falling out of favour with the big boys in Istanbul. So he now also instigated correspondence with Queen Elizabeth over in Old Blighty, not forgetting to write to King Henry III over in France as well, hoping that they might assist him, whether it be against the Ottomans or the Spanish in any event. What the French and English must have thought about these two rival factions, both lobbying for support against their own supposed allies, can only make you wonder. The dispossessed claimant soon also unfortunately died, and his son, Abu Abdallah Muhammad II, who was on the anti-Ottoman side of the family, felt so aggrieved by his uncle's ongoing betrayal that he now also secretly corresponded with Portugal's king, Sebastião, because, well, there was no love lost between the Portuguese and the Spanish, and all things considered, they seemed like a good horse to bet on at the time, despite having occupied and crippled all of his country's seaports. Now, young King Sebastião had spent much of his youth under the tutelage of Jesuits and remnant Knights Templar who had found refuge in Portugal after being exterminated pretty much everywhere else in Europe. And it seems these holy warriors inculcated a deep desire in him to go on a crusade. But even he was not so naive as to think he could liberate the Holy Land, so taking a crack at Fez seemed as good an opportunity to prove his Christian valour as anywhere else. Now, with this petition from the dispossessed wannabe sultan, Sebastião effectively had a pretext, as well as local support, to invade Morocco properly. Consequently, he advertised his potential campaign as a legitimate crusade, with fools and adventurers all across Europe making their way to join him. The army, on its way to link up with Abdallah Muhammad's own forces, eventually swelled to an impressive 23,000 troops, comprised of the flower of the Portuguese nobility, several thousand Castilian volunteers, 3,000 Flemish and German mercenaries, 600 Italians, and a battalion of over 40 cannons, transferred to North Morocco by 500 ships. They had no sooner landed than the impetuous young king and his desperate Moroccan ally headed boldly for the capital, without properly accessing their existing resources and network, and were soon intercepted by a much larger force of 60,000 troops that had been substantially reinforced by elite Ottoman janissaries, cavalry, and artillery. The quasi-crusaders soon found themselves completely outflanked in the open by a much larger army, and in the desperate fighting that followed, all three of the leaders perished, hence the name, Battle of the Three Kings, in 1578. By the end of the day's fighting, almost all of Portugal's noblemen were dead, and the ransom of the few that remained alive almost bankrupted the treasury. It was the single biggest military disaster in Portugal's history, while the loss of the childless young king now led to a succession crisis that saw Philip II of Spain, Sebastião's Habsburg uncle, make a direct claim for the Portuguese crown, which he backed up with an army of 40,000 troops that occupied the country in 1580 and crushed the modest opposition that could be mustered against him. Portugal was now forced into an uneasy personal union with Spain, and though much of their bureaucracy remained separate, the Lusitanian kingdom suffered the loss of much of its colonial revenue to Madrid, as well as becoming an unwilling party to all of Spain's current wars, particularly against the English, the French, and the Dutch, who proceeded to attack Portuguese colonial holdings with unrestrained gusto. You see, when Spain took control of Portugal, they immediately shut off access to the Lisbon spice market that was, by now, bringing in huge amounts of spices from Portuguese holdings in India and the Asian Pacific market. Now, if there's one thing the Dutch love more than tulips and windmills, it's cloves. So this trade embargo encouraged Dutch merchants to establish maritime trading companies of their own, such as the Dutch East India Company, which would go on to challenge Portuguese and Spanish control of the high seas and turn it into the first global corporate superpower. One by one, Portuguese trade concessions began to fall to the Dutch. Formosa, Ceylon, Malacca, the Philippines, Japan, almost the entirety of their African outposts, and for a short time in the early 1620s, even their Brazilian holdings, with the newly formed Dutch West India Company taking possession of lucrative sugar plantations in the New World.